The second part of our fourth lecture will be devoted to poetry. The second major field of literary achievement for this period is indeed that of poetry. Not only did major poets emerge, but poetry also overflowed to encompass other literary fields, most prominently drama, since nearly every playwright was also a poet, including, of course, William Shakespeare. We cannot mention every name, but the one most closely associated with Queen Elizabeth and deserving to be first examined was Edmund Spenser. Spenser mythicized and glorified his sovereign as Gloriana in his massive allegorical poem in 6 books and numberless cantos. A canto is a chant, The Fairy Queen. Now, this is one of the longest poems in the language. It develops the adventures of several knights, including a female warrior, Britomart, in a fantasy universe, the fantasy universe of fairyland, where they go on quests, overcome ordeals, encounter hosts of enemies and friends, all of them allegorical and magical, plus dragons, lions, dwarves, giants, elves, wizards, sea monsters, caves, islands, fountains, forests, castles, treasures, you name it. Young contemporary readers might call it an immersive video game universe, if you see what I mean. Some of the allegorical themes are easy to interpret. For instance, you have evil Catholic Jewessa, number 2, causing strife and division versus pure gentle unity, number 1, embodying the Protestant faith. And of course she is to be protected by the Red Cross Knight, i.e. a personification of England, St. George, patron saint of England, whose flag is indeed a red cross on a white background. You also have allegories of the 7 deadly sins and Gloriana herself as the radiant Queen Bee finally restoring order. But much of it is pure poetry, pure nostalgic medieval delight, reveling in archaic words and an overkill of imagery. Because of course the times of knights in shining armor rescuing damsels in distress were already gone, and just like they are for us themes of fairy tale imagery, they were already for the Elizabethan. Quite adapted to this type of pure poetry is the verse form Spenser devised, the magnificent Spenserian stanza, 8 iambic pentameters followed by an alexandrine or iambic hexameter, with the final 2 lines rhyming. Now, I have given you an example here, but maybe we could have a look at, yes, the texts. First the dedication. It's very interesting because it reminds you that poets in those days were not independent. They were highly dependent on patronage, most obviously court patronage from the monarch. Spenser here is really going over the top. To the most high, mighty and magnificent Empress, renowned for piety, virtue, and all gracious government, Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland, and of Virginia, defender of the faith. You remember U and V were not yet quite distinct. We have a number of interesting details. Elizabeth is, of course, Queen of England, but she's also Queen of France. That's the old Plantagenet claim to the throne of France. She's Queen of Ireland. Ever since the early Middle Ages, England had invaded Ireland and claimed that the English king was also the King of Ireland, trying to impose not only sovereignty, but under Elizabeth also the Protestant faith to a majority that had remained Catholic, hence a number of rebellions. She's also described as Queen of Virginia. Interesting, the new lands being discovered in America were now treated as new kingdoms, And indeed, the colony of Virginia had been named in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, because she had never married. She's also Defender of the Faith. Now, this one is almost funny because this title had been given to her father, Henry VIII, by the Pope, though of course later on he broke with Rome. Still, she kept the title, and it's still there today. The poet himself is her most humble servant Edmund Spenser, who doth in all humility dedicate, present, and consecrate these his labours to live with the eternity of her fame. Now, this is typical of Elizabethan enjoyment of language for its own sake. You see, instead of one word, 3 words, meaning almost the same thing, but there's pleasure in just adding more and more and more words. The same can be noticed in the passage below. It's one of the most famous passages in the Fairy Queen. It's the Bower of Bliss. You could translate that as, I don't know, like Caverne de Délices or something like that. It's a sort of place where Venus is holding court, you might say. This is from Book 2, Canto 12. The language is rather difficult, and as I mentioned, Spenser was using words that even for Elizabethans were archaic. Here, for instance, you have eftsoons, simply meaning soon. So maybe we won't go through the first 2 stanzas. We'll have only we'll take a look at the 3rd stanza, which is more accessible. It will give you an idea of the music and the beauty of the Spenserian stanza. There, whence that music seemed heard to be, whence, from where, was the fair witch herself now solacing with a new lover. You see, Elizabethan spelling, typical. The final E is sometimes still there, but it's no longer pronounced. So Venus, a fair witch, is solacing, trouve des consolations, with a new lover, yes, of course, whom through sorcery and witchcraft she from far did thither bring. You remember, thither to that place. There she had him, now laid us slumbering, in secret shade after long wanton joys. Well, modern spelling, you, here it's an O, but it means the same thing. Elle le fait sommeiller, in secret shade after long wanton joys. Well, maybe that's Elizabethan code language for sex. Whilst round about them pleasantly did sing many fair ladies and lascivious boys, that ever mixed their song with light licentious toys. You see the alliteration, L, 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 and then the final line, ever so long, rhyming, boys, toys. Sing, slumbering, sorcery, be. Joys, boys, toys. Right. Okay, this is over-the-top imagery. Language for the sake of language. Pure poetry, pure aestheticism. Now, let's get back to the original lecture script. There you have an image from the 1598 edition with, of course, the Red Cross Knight. It's not in color, obviously, but you can see he's got a shield, and on the shield you have a red cross on a white background. Spenser's life was pretty sad. He was a man from humble origins, and he long sought court patronage. When finally he obtained it, he got an estate in Ireland with confiscated lands. You understand from what I told you about Ireland that there were rebellions and rebellions and rebellions because, of course, the Catholic majority could not accept this imposition from outside of the Protestant religion, among many other grievances. So very often rebellions were followed by repression, burning, looting, killing, and confiscation of lands, the lands being given to colonists. This is how Spencer got Kilcolman Castle. But then there was another rebellion, and Kilcolman Castle was burnt to the ground. Back in London, Spencer died very poor. Other works that might be of interest, there is the Shepherd's Calendar. I have given you a few excerpts in the course brochure. It's a typical Elizabethan thing, a collection of poems with a poem for each month. Okay, why not? He also wrote sonnets, most famously the Amoretti, and he was a great translator. Like so many Elizabethan poets, he translated from Du Bellay, Virgil. Okay. The next important name I must mention is Sir Philip Sidney. He was a high-ranking nobleman, a courtier, a scholar, traveling diplomat. He went all the way to France, Germany, even Poland. He was also a soldier, and he died young, fighting in the Netherlands, where, of course, the English crown supported the Dutch Protestants who revolted against the Spanish crown, of course, Spain being the most important Catholic power in Europe at the time. The poetic fame of Sidney rests mainly on sonnets. The most famous collection is Astrophel and Stella, in which he mythologized himself, Astrophel, the star lover, and Penelope as the star, Stella, of course. There is also, we've already mentioned it, the pastoral Arcadia, the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, which is mostly in prose, and he also wrote a famous essay, The Defense of Poesy. Now, Sidney is fairly accessible. Here, for instance, I think, yes, there is a sonnet, but it's sort of difficult. You remember the sonnet form? 14 lines, iambic pentameters, not necessarily rhyming, except for the final couplet. Possess ungratefulness, you see. So that is your English sonnet, one solid block of 14 lines. This is rather difficult, but you have a song from the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. It's typical, it's fairly innocuous here. There's nothing occult, as we have seen in Sir Francis Bacon. My true love hath my heart, and I have his. By just exchange, one for the other given. I hold his dear, and mine he cannot miss. There was never a bargain better driven. Jamais marché n'a été mieux conclu. His heart in me keeps me, and him in one. My heart in him his thoughts and senses guides. He loves my heart, for once it was his own. I cherish his, because in me it bides. Parce qu'en moi il demeure. You see this tendency, and there we're back to John Lilly, this tendency to use rhetoric, to use tropes, conceits, conceptual ideas, play with words. You see, my heart, his heart, pronouns, me, I, his, mine. You see, they couldn't resist that temptation, typical of Elizabethans. Then, of course, I must mention a number of the playwrights who were also poets in their own right. The most important one is, of course, Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is reserved for our next lecture. So I'll mention only Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, the two most important playwrights after Shakespeare. Marlowe was like so many Elizabethan poets and playwrights, he was a translator. He translated a lot from Latin, but his most successful poetic creation is the unfinished poetic tale of Hero and Leander. This is the classic Greek story of the two lovers separated by the Hellespont. Nowadays you would call that the Dardanelles. So on one side you have Leander, and every night he has to swim across to join his beloved hero. Of course, until tragedy strikes, he will drown. So I'm giving you here lines from the two opening portraits. You've got Hero, the young woman, on the left, and on the right you've got Leander, the young man. We won't read through everything, just to give you a taste of it. The beginning. Upon her head she wear, well, of course it's she wore, a myrtle wreath, une couronne de myrte, from whence her veil reached to the ground beneath. Veil. You see what we said? Final E, not pronounced. Spelling still hesitating. Here is an A. In modern contemporary English, of course, that would be V-E-I-L, but it's the same word. Her veil was artificial flowers and leaves, whose workmanship both man and beast deceives. Another typical Elizabethan thing. The sentence starts with a preterite, her veil was, but it ends with a present tense. No problem for Elizabethan poetry. Many would praise the sweet smell as she passed, when 'twas the odour which her breath forth cast. 'Twas. You also have it in the present with 'tis, it was. You understand, her breath is so sweet that when she passes by, people turn around and smell. With Leander on the right, it really goes erotic. You'll see the description. Marlowe really goes very far about the shoulders, the belly, everything. This is to give you an idea of how much Elizabethan poets enjoyed the language for its own sake. And in poetry, you had almost complete freedom. In prose, as I said, there were strong limitations. But in poetry, as long as you referred to not really God, but Jove, Jupiter, the Greek and Roman gods, there was no problem. You could go very far, down to eroticism, as you have it here. I must also mention Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson is much more sober than Marlowe. He was probably the first poet laureate. That is an interesting notion. If you want to know what it is, well, just refer to the footnote you have here. Poet laureate it still exists today. It's an official court position. You are being paid to write verse for court occasions like births, marriages, or maybe grand events like state funerals. Technically, the first one was Dryden, but Jonson was so constantly under the patronage of James I that you can consider him as the first poet laureate. He wrote a lot of librettos for masques. This is something we will study later on with lecture 6. He is, as I said, more sober than Marlowe, though some of his lyrics, including those that have been included in his plays, for instance, his most famous play, Volpone, are indeed celebrating the joys of love. You see the one on the right here, to Celia. Come, my Celia, let us prove, while we may, the sports of love. Time will not be ours forever. He, at length, our good will sever. Spend not, then, his gifts in vain. Suns that set may rise again. But if once we lose this light, 'tis with us perpetual night. You see, it's that classic theme of carpe diem, enjoy it while you can. Now, to conclude on this section about poetry, oh yes, by the way, I'm not mentioning the metaphysical poets, some of them belonging to the Jacobean era. This will all be mentioned later on in lecture 6. Maybe, yes, we could conclude by, first of all, underlining the fact that we're not mentioning all the names. We couldn't do that, really. Maybe we ought even to have mentioned the authorized version of the Bible. That is an official translation into English that was under the patronage of King James, because it really helped to standardize poetic English. So, first thing, we're not mentioning all the names. I have given you only the major names. Then, second thing we must mention again is the fact that this is all about the acquisition of new powers of language, new iambic energy. This will be confirmed in our study of blank verse with drama. New formats, new ideas, new self-awareness, sheer pleasure in freely playing with words and rhetoric. A new capacity to absorb both past and present. The medieval past, as with Spencer, and as well as Italian, French, Spanish contemporary influences. New reaches towards strangeness, sensuousness. It's almost like it's in the image of that generation of young men and young women finding new creativity and, ready to wear bizarre outfits. For instance, we have plenty of Elizabethan portraits where you see young men wearing pearl earrings, you see Queen Elizabeth wearing extravagant dresses and shoes. It's all natural. It was that explosion of creativity. Lurching towards Baroque mannerism, a bit bizarre, irregular, and certainly without the future restraints, the rules of what came afterwards, classicism. But we were not yet there.